This is a video on shooting the messenger and nationalism. I think it's a good idea for me to include three different peoples who have fought very hardly for the national liberation of their people. In my writing, I use the term shooting the messenger to mean when somebody misidentifies something and they end up hating the wrong thing, where they end up hating the tool of the oppressor instead of hating the oppressor's use of that tool. So I'd like to just go through some examples of that and really thoroughly and smoothly go through nationalism, the dialectics of it. Because some dude got in a giant argument with me months ago about it, and then I had completely forgotten who he was, and he sent me his post on nationalism. And I was like, who the fuck is this guy? And I'd completely forgotten about him, and I ignored the post. But a few weeks later, he messaged me. After I deleted him, he messaged me, and I still haven't replied to him. Now, this guy's problem is that he relies on his anecdotal experience of US white nationalism and US funded white nationalism internationally. These are the two most violent examples of nationalism that there are. And this guy, he has studied this extensively, but only on these topics. So he has years of this study, years of seeing horrific results, but only tied to these very, very limited set of examples. This is an extreme danger with anecdotal experience. Our anecdotal experience is way too convincing. Now that guy was super freaking annoying, but I'm very, very excited to make this video. Because nationalism is historically one of the largest forces for revolution and for uniting people. The national identity of your people is something that ties you together. It ties you together against oppressors. It ties you so close. The national identity brings you together with strangers to the point that you'll be willing to die for people that you don't even know. Americans have been hit so hard and for so long with this fetishization of the conception of freedom. Now, that conception of freedom is a capitalist freedom. Generally, it is linked to the freedom to not have to pay taxes and the freedom to not adhere to government regulation. Now, the bourgeois freedom, it's so wishy-washy. The constant glorification of the conception of that idea of so-called freedom is so vacuous, it's so empty, it's so hollow. Based on that idea, you would think that most people enlisting in the military are joining to defend that so-called freedom, but it's not the case at all. Roughly 80% of, more than 80% of Americans in the military explicitly said it was for one of three things: healthcare, education, and housing. These people ship off overseas to go stand by and murder people under imperialism. They leave their families, they leave everything they've ever known, just so they can get housing, just so they can get some education, just so that they can get some basic medical care. So the bourgeois concept of freedom is wishy-washy horseshit, but freedom for people who are fighting against oppression is a very real thing. People fighting against oppression will have an incredibly powerful and unmovable national unity against that source of oppression, against empire, against imperialism. Check out these earrings that my partner got me. Hammer and sickle earrings made out of elk bones. Let's take a quick dig at shooting the messenger and some examples of it. The funniest one is gun control, where right-wingers have a much more compelling argument than liberals, because liberals are unable to take a Marxist analysis of guns and gun violence. So right-wingers say that guns don't kill people, people kill people, and they're right. Guns make it a lot easier to kill people, but the underlying fucking problem is the desire to kill people. Where liberals are wishy-washy yokels and they just harp and focus on the guns because they're unwilling, either they're too ignorant or they're just too liberal to focus on the causes of gun violence, which is racism, misogyny, alienation, hatred, patriarchy, capitalism, class relations, all the different things that go wrong. Those are the things that need to be addressed to properly address gun violence. Guns is the funniest one. The next biggest one probably is religion, where people take their traumatic anecdotal experience of religion in the West and they suggest that all people in the world who are religious are just idiots for being religious. 88% of the world is religious, dog. Please, please, please don't take the Western trauma experience of religion and suggest that represents 8 billion people. It doesn't. Don't center your own traumatic experience. Please, dog. The next funniest is the hatred of the state. Anarchists do this big time, and it's so frustrating because they're so close. The state is a tool like guns, like religion, like a fork, like a spoon, like a car, like a laptop, etc. It's the ruling class's use of that thing that makes it violent and malicious. Now, the problem of people hating the state is that it's a very, very, very big tool. It's a little bit more complex and a bigger piece of machinery than a car or a spoon. But ultimately, it's a tool, and if the right people are in charge of it, it can be a very effective tool. And it is. Where in our countries, police are paid $100,000+ a year to ignore the marginalized people's calls for help and to protect capitalist production. But in Cuba and socialist countries, amazing things have been accomplished. In Cuba, they have the strongest feminist legislation in the world. With the Cuban family code, if you abuse your family, you get kicked the fuck out of your house, your family keeps your house, and you go the fuck to jail. And this was accomplished by a whole bunch of people getting together and deciding on how best to most effectively use the very, very, very big tool, which is the state. And it is controlled by their people to make incredible progress. Now, there is a fuck of a lot of other examples I could use, but I want to skip to the fun part. I'll read for you that guy's post to me, and then I'll read his messages to me. Quote, ahem.
The nation does not exist in nature. The nation has to be invented. The nation is an imagined community, moving forward through history as one. To imagine a community of people, you have to define who belongs to that community, and the flip side of that is defining who is excluded from the nation. Therefore, nationalism is always an exercise in exclusion. Similarly, the fact that nationalism is the creation of a historical community means that its history has to be defined or remembered. But this is also a flip side. Creating a nationalist historical narrative is less about collective memory and more about collective forgetting. Any historical facts that are inconvenient to the present political project have to be suppressed. And forgetting history is not a passive thing, it is an active and violent thing. This is true whether it's nationalism of oppressors or nationalism in the colonies. It can't just be a strange coincidence that all the nation states in places like Africa and the Middle East coincide with the borders drawn by the colonial powers.
Now, the first few lines are absolute dog shit, but near the end, he says a couple things that make a bit of sense. So, his struggle is because he's so mired in US funded nationalism. That is what he sees. So, he's correct in analyzing that there is a very violent focus in talking about the forgetting of history. The forgetting of history, the erasure of history, national national identity, collective forgetting, and a collective washing of how things were, and rewriting of how things were. But the struggle is this guy's hyper focus on US funded nationalism is just seeing so much violence and trauma from Yugoslavia and its destruction. Back to him being a knob. Then, after I ignored him, weeks later he messaged me saying,
I think I figured you out. You're literally using nationalism as a synonym for decolonization, not as an aspect of decolonization. So being skeptical of nationalism to you means being skeptical of decolonization itself. Nationalism studies a huge body of scholarship with many schools of theory. So I'm sorry if I didn't see how non-academically you're using the term. The scholarly consensus is that the modernist school, which states that the nation exists only in the postmodern French Revolution world, but I think you're using it differently.
Now, I didn't reply to him because I had already spent probably 100 comments arguing with this guy, and there's no getting through to him because he's not listening to somebody who studies extensively international revolution, international relations, and the political science. And instead, he stays ensnared by what he has studied very deeply, and his analysis is very limited because of that. But enough of this freaking yokel. Let's look through something fucking awesome. With this, we have a view and we have the science of why colonized peoples are the revolutionary force in each settler state. Our favorite Georgian political activist wrote that a nation is a historically constituted, stable community of people formed on the basis of common language, territory, economic life, and psychological makeup manifested in a common culture. Now, if we're using this definition, it's so effective. It's so simple. It shows a group of people who are just with each other. They have harmony. They have unity in who they are as a people. And applying this definition, we can look at a settler state and immediately see that that harmony is not there, because what is there instead is a colonial institution of genocide. If we use that definition of a nation, then we can look and see a difference between a country and a nation, where Canada, Israel, Australia, and the United States are countries, but they are not nations. They are illegitimate bastard settler regimes focused on genocide and the disenfranchisement of a people. And the existence of those people is a threat to that regime. So, through the power of Marxist-Leninism and dialectical materialism, we can see that within Palestine, within the United States, within Canada, and Australia, colonized peoples are the people where revolutionary potential will continue to bloom. Black and Indigenous people are the people to be supporting, and their national efforts and their efforts to build for their people and their self-determination is where efforts need to lay. Just 3 final pieces and then I'll wrap this up. First one, I'd like to mention Vietnam. Vietnam led a huge war against occupation, against different powers attacking it, and they had the National Liberation Force, which was their revolutionary force against imperialism. This united many, many, many millions of people and led them to overcome power after power after power against all odds. So Vietnam's national liberation is a nationalism that is against the US white nationalist hegemony. So it is an anti-imperialist nationalism, nationalism against empire. This is the exact same science and application of indigenous nationalism / indigenous sovereignty and black nationalism. These are both revolutionary nationalisms that are starkly against white nationalism and against empire. And the third example is tied to both of these, because these revolutionary nationalisms, they're completely in line with internationalism, because these are driven by care, they're driven by love, they're driven by people wanting resources for their people. It is pro-social. It is for the interests of humanity. And tied to this is Arab nationalism, where the different countries were taken by different colonial powers, but they still support each other. Each different country in the so-called Middle East, correctly called West Asia, there's a bunch of other names, West Asia and North Africa, are colonized by different colonial powers, but they still support each other. Where Syria has its own unique history, but it is not alone in being against the colonial powers. So they lend each other so much solidarity, so much power, so much strength. And this is why all of them support Palestine so powerfully, because Palestine is the tip of the spear of the US's ongoing imperialist project. And the people of those nations can look at the history, they can see their own ongoing experience, or they can look at their neighbors being bombed. Where Jordan, for example, has largely been an accomplice to the US, and they have not been bombed and obliterated like Yemen or Syria or Iran, to the varying extents that they have. But people from Jordan have so much care to the people of Palestine and the Arab anti-imperialist struggle. Sorry for making this video so long. There's just way too many related things to talk about, and it would be remiss for me to neglect these things. I think the last thing I want to say is that with Palestine being the tip of the resistance and the most heightened contradiction of imperialism and the strongest ongoing colonialism and the strongest antagonisms of the US, that is where things are happening for the whole world. The whole world is tied up in what's going on there, because capitalism is built on exploitation. It's built on expropriation. If the expropriation ends, it collapses. It has the same dynamic as a black hole or cancer. It needs to grow or it'll die. So if Israel falls and the US loses its military base in that region and it's unable to destabilize that region, then that region is free. And that region will not focus on aiding Europe. It'll not focus on profiting the US. They'll focus on themselves, and they'll focus on internationalism. And tied to this is Spain. Spain was incredibly powerful for 400 years, and then it lost to the US, and it began selling all its colonies, and the US attacked the fuck out of Spain and the Philippines. So Spain is the example where you're so powerful and then you lose your colonies and then you're irrelevant. The US is in that stage right now where its hegemony of the world is slipping